Good morning. There's a lot of energy here, which is great. Renewable energy, right? Everyone ate purely renewable, sustainable food. Yeah, anyway, okay. So welcome. The last week has been a pretty amazing week in the world. There's a lot to celebrate. There's still a lot of problems in the world, but I think it's worth at least taking a brief moment to celebrate some good trends in the world. We're really, really excited you've all come here today for what's the second, we hope annual, we'll see, Sustainability at Scale. We did the first one a year ago, and it was unbelievably great, so we decided to do it again. And I think today will be even better. We've got an incredible lineup of sessions and speakers and panelists and a debate, which hopefully will be raucous and interesting and exciting. I think everybody here, I certainly know I am, everyone here is on a journey to live a better life, to help make the world, or their organizations and the world, more sustainable. The problems we face are enormous and complex, and are really hard for any of us to solve by ourselves, either individually or as a company, or for that matter, as a state or a nation. They are global and interconnected. And one of the things that actually I have loved the most, I've been at Facebook now 3.5 years, but one of the things that I love about this company is the spirit of collaboration and openness, that we approach problems by working with others, not by just trying to solve them in our own silo. And that's part of why we host this event and other at-scale events on other topics, to really try to bring people together, some of the leading thinkers and practitioners in a field, to talk about hard problems, to talk about what's going well and the successes, and to learn from each other, and to dig into hard questions. So my hope today is that you'll make some new connections, there'll be some really interesting conversations, that some new ideas for collaborations will come out, and in the process will help push the world toward a more sustainable path. So let's all celebrate. One of the things in that spirit, I'd like to say, let's all celebrate the amazing work that everyone here is doing. Certainly at Facebook, I feel like we're doing some incredible things around sustainability. All the other organizations I know of that are represented here are doing some really wonderful work. And at the same time, if you look at many global indicators, the world is still headed in not such a great direction. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, and not to just talk about the wonderful things that are going on, but to also then ask, what can we do collectively to really make a difference on some of those global problems? So please engage today, ask hard questions, be nice, but ask hard questions. Okay, so before we dive into the program, I want to point out a few logistical things. You're allowed into the area on the side. It's open for lunch and breaks. It's open all the time. You can go through that door there. If you need to go to the bathroom, restrooms over there. If you need to take a call, please do it out there, not in here. If you need to do email, well, you can do that sitting at your chair. There's a blocked off area outside where we're going to have a reception at the end of the day. Please do not wander off. We've got security people who will probably prevent you from doing that, but if you do manage to escape them, someone will, gently stop you at some point. Lunch will be here. We'll open this up again. We'll actually open up that wall for the breaks. Lunch we'll go through the line to the cafeteria and bring lunch back into here, and I think outside as well. We set up a Facebook group that I think everyone's been invited to, but you should join if you haven't. If you don't have a Facebook page, find a Facebook employee. We can set you up with one. For today, special deal only today, it's free. The Facebook group is Sustainability at Scale 2015. And if you type that into the search box at the top of the Facebook app or on your browser, you should be able to find it. There's also a hashtag, Sustainability at Scale. You can use that on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, your favorite social media. And then one last thing before we dive into things, I want to acknowledge and thank all the people who put in an enormous amount of work over the last several months putting this event together. Having now done this twice and done a few other events over the years, it always seems like an awesome idea to do an event, and after the event, it always feels great to have done it. But the process of doing it, there's a lot that has to come together, and people on my team, people on the events team, the communications team, the recruiting team, a whole bunch of other people put in a lot of work to put together the program, to put together all the logistics to make today happen so that we'd have food and refreshments and mics that work and so on and so on. So I just want to thank them. I'll thank them again at the end of the day. We can give them a big round of applause then, but I thought it was important to acknowledge them now. Okay, so let's get going. I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Gleick. Peter is the co-founder and president of the Pacific Institute. He co-founded, I think, in 1987. Is that right? And has worked there since on environmental issues involving issues around the world, especially about water. He's been widely recognized for his work, including as a MacArthur Fellow, visionary on the environment, as he was called by the British Broadcasting Corporation, and a number of other honors. So we are deeply honored to have Peter here today, and he's going to talk to us about what a sustainable water future looks like. So, Peter.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Bill. I'm delighted to be here. Before Bill's introduction, I didn't know you were allowed to say the word Twitter on this campus. I'm going to talk about water, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of sustainability. As Bill mentioned, water, environment, energy, ecosystems, all of these things that we care about are interconnected. When we talk about sustainability, we argue all the time in the community about what that really means. I think intuitively people sort of understand what it means. It means integration. It means dealing with all of these broad issues we worry about. It means intergenerational questions, not just problems today, but something that we're hoping to sustain for a long time. I'm going to focus on water. It happens to be the thing that I work on the most. But I could be talking about energy. I could be talking about any number of the other issues that are related to the health of the planet broadly. And I'm hoping at the end I'll leave a little bit of time for questions. We'll see how that works out. I'm going to talk about peak water and what that means. I'm going to talk about some new trends and challenges in the water world. I'm going to talk about the California drought. How many of you are not from California or haven't been here for 5 years or so? Okay, so lots of you. We're in a drought. The sooner you learn that, the better. We're in a bad drought, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of water in general, the problems the Western U.S. and the rest of the world have with water, but specifically in the context of the drought. And then I'm going to talk at the end about solutions. Ultimately, we could talk about problems all we want. I like to talk about solutions because I truly think that there are solutions to our energy, water, environmental problems broadly. I think we're moving in the right direction, perhaps not fast enough, but I think there are solutions out there. I'm going to talk about some of them. Okay, so first, just a quick reminder of the importance of a modern water system. I think probably it's a safe bet that all of you grew up with a modern water system. And the truth is you take it for granted. You go to the bathroom and you flush the toilet and magically the wastes disappear. And you turn on your tap in the morning and incredibly low-cost, high-quality water comes out of that tap. That's not the reality for much of the rest of the world, but it is our reality. And so a quick reminder, first of all, water is connected to everything. It's connected to the production of food. All of the food you ate this morning required water to produce it. It's connected to industrial productivity and the goods and services that we make and export and import and consume. Forests, ecosystem health, energy, all of these things have a water component, which is one of the reasons why I happen to like the topic, because it does integrate a lot of the things that we care about. But we didn't always have a modern water system. In the 1800s, water-related diseases, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, were rampant, even in what we consider the modern world, in Europe, in North America. And cholera, for example, this is an old magazine cover showing cholera sweeping across populations and decimating populations primarily in the mid-1800s, 1850 or so, in Europe and in the United States. This is actually a graph that shows, you may not be able to read some of the details, but this is a graph that shows typhoid deaths in the city of Philadelphia starting around 1887 on the far left and going up to about 1943. And basically in 1910, 1915, 1920 or so, the United States and Philadelphia started putting in place the first pieces of a modern water system. Filtration, chlorination was introduced to our water system, killing bacteria and killing germs. And the deaths from cholera and the deaths from typhoid and the deaths from water-related diseases in general, which were rampant, disappeared. People don't die from cholera and typhoid related to water problems in the United States anymore. That's one of the advantages of a modern water system. And again, this is a system we take for granted today, but it's not a system that's universal. And so today, in the 21st century, there are still 2.5 billion people or so worldwide that don't have adequate sanitation services. 2.5 billion people is more people than were on the planet in the 1930s or 1940s. It's a very large number. There are 800 million or so that lack safe drinking water. And the failure to have safe drinking water and safe sanitation leads to water-related diseases, to cholera, dysentery, typhoid. These are diseases that we still have worldwide, even if we don't have them in the industrialized world. And there are millions of preventable deaths every year from these diseases, mostly children, mostly under the age of 5. Probably 2 million deaths a year from preventable water-related diseases. These are diseases we know how to prevent. There are water quality challenges, old ones like sewage, new ones like industrial wastes and certain kinds of industrial chemicals and contaminants that are not yet addressed by our water quality laws or technology. Ecosystems are deteriorating. All of the water that we use comes out of the natural environment. Before humans were a global planetary force, ecosystems used all the water. And as human populations grew, as civilizations grew, as we took more and more water out of the system, that water comes from the natural environment. And in places where populations are especially large, where water's kind of scarce, I'll come back to some of this in a little bit later, ecosystems in particular are suffering. And again, if you're a Californian or have lived here for any length of time, you understand the ecosystem challenges associated with human uses of water here. But that's true worldwide. Political conflicts over water are growing. One of the things we do at the Pacific Institute is we maintain something called the Water Conflict Chronology. You can Google it, Google Water Conflict Chronology. It's a history going back 4,500 or 5,000 years of conflicts, violent conflicts over water in myths and legends, in history. And frankly, every day in the news today, there's some other piece of news where water was a target during a conflict or water was being used as a weapon. Water and politics are tightly connected. And that's part of our water challenge. And of course, the climate's changing. We know the climate's changing. We know that humans are causing the climate to change. And we also know that there are going to be very extensive, wide impacts of climate change. And some of the worst impacts will be on water resources. The hydrologic cycle that you all remember from 5th grade, evaporation, the formation of clouds, condensation, precipitation, runoff, back to evaporation, that is the climate cycle. As we change the climate, we will be affecting and are already affecting water resources around the world. And that's a new challenge that we're not yet adequately addressing. So I'm going to talk specifically about water now, and I want to introduce the concept of peak water. Many of you probably have heard about peak oil. A colleague of mine and I wrote a paper a couple of years ago about peak water. I'm going to try and define what I mean by that and what it means in the context of some of our water challenges. But before I do that, let me describe a little bit. Again, Bill introduced the concept of renewable resources. I want to define actually what a renewable and a non-renewable resource is for those of you not familiar with this. And there are lots of ways to think about this. But from my perspective, the easiest is Non-renewable resources are stock limited. They're limited by the amount that's there. And you think about fossil fuels are non-renewable resources. There's a stock of fossil fuels out there, oil, gas, coal, and when you use up the stock, it's gone. On a time scale of interest to humans, fossil fuels are not renewable, and so they're stock limited. You can have what's there, but no more. Renewable resources could be defined as flow limited. The amount you use has no effect on the amount you get tomorrow or the amount that's available. And think about solar energy as the classic renewable resource. The amount of solar energy we use on the planet has no effect on what the sun produces tomorrow. But the amount that we can use is limited by our ability to collect the flow. We could cover the planet with solar collectors and capture all of the sunlight incident on the planet, and that's it. Now, that's a lot. But it's flow limited, not stock limited. Water is interesting because water actually has non-renewable and renewable characteristics. And I'm going to talk about these in a little more detail. There are some fixed stocks of water, and there are flows of water. And those renewable and non-renewable characteristics of water are also an important part of trying to understand how to manage water more sustainably. So now I'm going to talk about peak water in the context of three definitions. Peak renewable water, peak non-renewable water, and what I call peak ecological water. And I'm going to do it in the context of these shapes that you're all familiar with. This is, of course, exponential growth. In some ways, exponential growth is the biggest challenge behind all of our sustainability challenges. When things start to grow exponentially, unless it's your bank account, we tend to have problems. And some would argue that, in fact, an exponentially growing economy isn't all that perfect of an idea either, but I'm not going to talk about economics in that context. So, population. This is a graph of global population over the last 1,000 years. This is part of our problem, exponential growth in population. This is a graph of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over the last 1,000 years. Exponential growth. This is part of the climate problem. So exponential growth is a piece of this puzzle. The second curve I want to talk about is exponential growth followed by a peak in something and then a decline. And again, we see this in lots of different things. And for those of you perhaps more familiar with the concept of peak oil, this was the idea behind peak oil, that we would start to extract a non-renewable resource from the ground. And because it was non-renewable, it would get harder and harder to find and more expensive to get. And eventually there would be a peak in production and then a decline. And when the peak occurs and how big the peak is depends on technology and it depends on economics. But for a non-renewable resource, this is considered the classic shape. And in fact, when this concept for peak oil was described in the 1960s by a guy named M. King Hubbert, he predicted that peak oil in the United States would be reached around 1970. And there it is. This is the curve for peak oil in the United States. Oil production in the US peaked in 1970 and then started to decline. Now, in fact, the last couple of years it's ticked back up again because of the fracking boom and especially oil production from the Bakken shales in North Dakota, and it's gone up quite a bit. But that's temporary. There will be a peak. It may even exceed the 1970 peak, although I doubt it. But there will be a peak eventually, and then it will decline. That's a characteristic of a non-renewable resource. But we see the same kind of curve for other things. This is a graph of cod capture. Cod is a big fish in the North Atlantic, starting in 1950, down here, 1950s, and going up till about 2010. Cod are a renewable resource under certain conditions, if you let them reproduce and you don't over-harvest them. But for fisheries around the world, and cod in this example, they can be a non-renewable resource. And the cod fishery, like many fisheries worldwide, has been over-harvested. And the cod fishery in the North Atlantic was over-harvested. There was a peak of production in about the mid-1980s, and then the populations crashed. And I don't know whether, in fact, those populations will ever recover. But this is another example of a peak in a natural system. The third curve is this. It's the logistics curve. Small use of something or small something followed by exponential growth, followed by a leveling off, and then sustainability of something. You're sustaining something over the long term. And again, we see this curve in a lot of different places. We see it especially in technology development. This is a graph from 1900 to 2000 of the penetration of landline telephones in the United States. So the telephone was invented. People decided, gee, I'd like a telephone. And they bought telephones. And then everybody had a telephone. And 100% of the population had a telephone. And there you go. Now, in fact, this graph probably ought to just say telephones, because landline telephones, they're probably declining now. I mean, how many of you don't own a landline telephone? Okay, so in fact, this curve has maybe peaked and started to decline. But you get the idea, and lots of technologies follow this kind of curve. Something smart's invented, we buy it, then everybody's got one, and they forget to turn off their ringer at a conference. There's probably another curve for learning how to use new technology. But this is a graph that shows the same kind of thing. It's cumulative capacity of dams, the amount of water stored behind dams in the United States. And it shows, first of all, we didn't build many big dams. The dates, you can't read in the back, but the dates are from 1850 up until the present. 1850s, we didn't build many big dams. The technology wasn't available for building big dams. The need was not so great. We learned how to build big dams. We started to build a lot of big dams. We built massive numbers of big dams, and then we stopped. And the amount of capacity, the water stored behind those dams in the United States, has leveled off. It may go up a tiny little bit, we might build a few more, but there are now constraints on our ability to add to that capacity. And those constraints are environmental. We now understand the environmental costs of building big dams. They're economic. We no longer massively subsidize big dams. They're political. There are lots of reasons, but there are also physical constraints. We've built on all the good dam sites in the western United States and some not so good dam sites. So the ability to expand this curve is pretty limited. So back to water specifically, the concept of peak renewable water is this curve. Think about a river. A river is a renewable resource. You can take water out of the river. It doesn't affect how much water it gets next year. That's part of the hydrologic cycle. We have wet years, we have dry years, but flow in a river is considered a renewable resource. We start to take water out of that river for human uses. We take more and more out of the river. There's a limit. That limit is the total renewable supply. Once you get it all, you can't have any more. And that's a peak renewable limit. And we're running into this problem on rivers around the world where we're taking the complete renewable flow of major rivers. We're taking the complete flow of the Colorado River. We might want more water out of the Colorado River, but we can't have any more because we're already taking it all. We take almost all of the water out of the Yellow River in China, out of the Nile in northern Africa. That's a renewable resource, but there's a limit, and that's what peak renewable water means. And it begs the question, how much should we actually take out? You can take it all and leave nothing for ecosystems. And in the 20th century, when we didn't know we ought to care about ecosystems, or we knew but we didn't care about ecosystems, that's what we did. We took it all. But that's part of the challenge for water. And here's the flow of the Colorado River in a million cubic meters per year from 1905 till about 2008. And it shows a lot of different things. On the far left of the curve, first of all, it shows natural variability, wet years and dry years. I guess I could go this way sometimes too. So wet years, dry years, wet years, dry years. The Colorado River is the biggest river in the southwestern part of the United States. It's shared by 7 states and Mexico. And like many arid region rivers, it's flashy. its extremes of wet and dry are pretty high, and that's really what we're seeing here, wet and dry years. But we're also seeing, over this period of time, decreases in flows. And that was a time when we were building those big dams and capturing the water on the Colorado and diverting it for agriculture and the big cities in the Southwest. And today, except in really, really wet years or sequences of wet years, zero water reaches the mouth of the Colorado River in Mexico. It's completely consumed, and that's peak renewable water. So peak non-renewable water is this curve. There are non-renewable stocks of water, and the best way to think about this is to think about the fossil fuel comparison. There are groundwater resources around the world, underground aquifers, that we use for agriculture, for industrial uses, for urban uses, that are non-renewable in the sense that they're recharged by nature very, very slowly. And when humans use them faster than nature recharges them, just like oil, groundwater levels drop, it gets more expensive to pump, and there becomes a peak in our ability to use those resources. And there are very large numbers of groundwater resources now that are being used in a non-renewable fashion. The Central Valley of California, massively overpumped groundwater. And groundwater levels are dropping, land is subsiding. It's a serious piece of a California water problem. But this is true in the Ogallala Aquifer in the Great Plains of the US, it's true in Libya, it's true in northern China, it's true in parts of India. As much as 30 to 40% of global food production comes from non-renewable water systems. And that's a problem. This is a map that shows the Ogallala Aquifer in the Great Plains, South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, just to place you, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas. This is the massive system of underground water reservoirs that have been overpumped. And the redder the color, the deeper, the faster the groundwater levels are falling. And this is groundwater that's being used to grow soybeans primarily and corn in the Great Plains. And there's serious overdraft. And farmers in the southern part of the basin are going out of production because they can no longer afford the energy to pump the groundwater to water low-valued crops. And this is the same thing for the Central Valley of California. Again, redder colors shows rapid declines, drops in groundwater levels, primarily in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley, Kern County, Tulare County, and this is as of last year. So that's peak non-renewable water. The idea of peak ecological water, I'm just going to talk about really quickly. I'm going to draw a graph here. The y-axis is the total economic value and ecological value of water. The x-axis is the amount of water used by humans. A quick comment on the y-axis. When we pump water, when we use water for something, we're producing economic value. We're making semiconductors, we're growing cotton and making clothing, we're growing food, and there's an economic value to that. There's also an ecological value to water use. Economists are really good at measuring the cost of a t-shirt. They're pretty bad at measuring the value, economic value of the extinction of a run of salmon. So there's a total value, an economic value and an ecological value to our water use. And we're good at measuring one thing and bad at measuring another, which means we tend to ignore the one we're not good at putting dollar values on. But those are real values. And the concept of peak ecological water is that as we start to extract water from a system, the total value we get out grows. We get more economic value. We're not harming necessarily the ecological value. But there comes a point, a peak, where the next unit of water you extract from the system causes more harm than it provides benefit, and the total value starts to decline. And that's part of the challenge in ecological economics now, which is an interesting field, to try and put a value on these ecological things that we care about, and to compare them with the much easier to quantify dollar values that we get by taking more and more out of a system, more water, more energy, more whatever. And so that's the concept of peak ecological water. So what does peak water really mean? Peak water does not mean we're going to run out of water. We're not going to run out of oil. Peak oil doesn't mean we're going to run out of oil. There will always be fossil fuels in the ground. And the reality is we ought to leave them there. But it doesn't mean we'll run out of water. It does mean we're going to run into limits on what we can do with the water resources we have. We're not going to run out of renewable water in the rivers. I mentioned the flow will come back next year for a renewable system. When water is non-renewable, we are going to run into stock constraints. For renewable systems, we run into flow constraints. Again, I've said this already. You might want more water out of the Colorado for agricultural purposes, for economic purposes, for growing cities, but you can't have any more. For non-renewable resources, we're going to run into stock constraints like the production of food from non-renewable water systems. That's going to be a growing problem. We already have a problem with growing food for 8 billion or 9 billion or 10 billion people, given constraints. What happens when some part of what we're already growing depends on resources that are not renewable? We have to find alternatives. We're going to run up against flow limits that are a combination of natural and economic constraints. This is not just a natural resource problem, it's an economic problem. And increasingly in watersheds around the world, we're running into ecological constraints. Part of the debate in California is not just cities versus farms. It's maybe we ought to be restoring ecosystems, and maybe there ought to be commitments of limited water back to the natural environment. So it's become a human environmental debate as well. Okay. In addition to these problems that I've described, there are some other issues that are related to the fact that water is connected to everything. And I'm going to talk very briefly about energy. I'll talk a little bit about climate and a little bit about policy, and then talk about the California drought. In terms of energy, it takes an enormous amount of water to produce the energy that we use with our traditional energy systems. It turns out the largest withdrawal of water in the United States is for energy. It's for cooling thermal power plants, nuclear and fossil fuel power plants. It's the biggest withdrawal of water in the United States. At the same time, it takes a lot of energy to produce and use the water that we all use. It takes energy to collect the water, to move water from one place to another, to treat it to the standards that we demand. Probably the biggest user of energy in most of your homes or apartments is the energy required to heat water. By some estimates, as much as 17 or 20% of all of the energy used in California goes to the water system that we have built and delivers the water services and benefits that we want. So energy and water are really tightly linked, but they're not well understood and they're badly managed together. We have energy utilities over here, we have water utilities over here. The policies are rarely integrated. That tends to be a problem. And decision makers and corporations ought to be thinking about energy and water and probably other resources as well in a much more integrated fashion. And conversely, the failure to think about energy and water together means we're going to make some bad decisions. We're going to make energy-intensive water decisions or water-intensive energy decisions. And the decision, for example, to build big centralized thermal power plants in water-scarce areas is a bad idea from a water perspective. And part of the debate about central solar power plants, central solar thermal power plants in Southern California is actually a debate about, is the water available to cool them? And what kind of cooling systems are we going to have to put in place to build a solar plant in the desert where the solar resources are superb? And that's part of the energy-water debate. I'm going to skip that, talk about climate. Let me say one, actually back up one. Part of the water energy debate is a climate debate. As we use energy, we emit greenhouse gases. So decisions about water actually affect decisions about energy, which actually affect the emissions of greenhouse gases. And just as one example, we do a lot of work at the Institute on the drought. We released a report about a month and a half ago or 2 months ago on the impacts of the drought on hydropower generation in California. We get, in a normal year, 15 or 20% of our electricity from hydro plants, some of those big dams that I talked about earlier. And hydro stations generate almost no greenhouse gases, certainly far fewer greenhouse gases than do fossil fuel plants. During the drought, we don't have water, we generate less hydro, we burn more natural gas. That's the marginal energy source for California. And we did an assessment of the loss of hydro because of the drought, the increase in natural gas production, which has an economic cost to ratepayers. We pay more for natural gas than we pay for hydro. But it also boosted the state's greenhouse gas emissions, which is a climate feedback. And I may come back to that when I talk about the drought. But that's the climate story in part. A little bit of background on climate. I'm not giving a climate talk, but just a little bit of information for those of you who don't know it. This is a graph that shows 800,000 years of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And 800,000 years ago is back here, and this is the present, 0, so thousands of years before the present. Concentration in parts per million shows a number of things. It shows CO2 concentrations go up and down naturally, and that's something that climate scientists have understood. Climate has varied in the past because of orbital dynamics, because of the changes in the tilt in the planet, because of changes in atmospheric concentrations produced by volcanoes and other natural phenomenon. And when CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are high, the Earth is in an interglacial, a warm period. When CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are low, down here, under 200 parts per million, we're actually in an ice age. We, the planet, are in an ice age. And the difference between an ice age and an interglacial is only about 50 or 75 parts per million CO2. And here's where we are today. We started in an interglacial. The pre-industrial concentration of CO2 on the planet was about 280 parts per million, 150, 200 years ago. And the planet was in an interglacial. We'd come out of an ice age 18,000 years ago, and the planet was nice and warm, and everybody was kind of happy. And we're now at over 400. And that increase from 280 to 400 is human emissions of carbon dioxide. That's the burning of fossil fuels. That's the industrial age. And that's the climate problem. This is the last 2,000 years of CO2 in the atmosphere. Again, it goes up and down a little bit, but again, this is the instrumental record, and here we are. Actually, this is temperature. Sorry. These are temperature anomalies showing the temperature on the planet over the last 2,000 years. Showing temperature goes up and down a little bit, but it's basically been fairly level for the last 2,000 years. And this is the actual temperature of the planet today. These are anomalies from the long-term average. So it isn't, the truth is we don't care so much about CO2. We care about the climate. And the climate is temperature, and it's storms, and it's sea level rise, and it's ocean acidification. This is the global warming component of the climate problem, but this is the problem that we face. And we know that climate change is already affecting water resources. We're already seeing more intense rainfall events. We already see actually more moisture in the atmosphere as temperature goes up, but wet areas seem to be getting wetter and dry areas seem to be getting drier. We see rising sea levels and impacts on coastal aquatic ecosystems. There are a whole range of water impacts that we already see and expect to get worse in the coming years because of climate change, as climate change gets worse. And this was the cover of Business Week, the week of Hurricane Sandy, after Hurricane Sandy hit the east coast of the United States. And I actually have this framed on my wall. It was part of the growing realization that these extreme events are no longer independent of human influence. The argument is not that climate change caused Sandy. The argument is that climate change influenced the impacts of Sandy. Sea level is 9 inches higher on the East Coast than it was 120 years ago because of climate change. And Sandy hit New York at high tide. So that extra 9 inches influenced the extent of flooding. Sea surface temperatures are hotter now than they used to be because of global warming. And the strength of hurricanes depends on the temperature of sea surfaces. Hurricanes draw their strength from warm ocean waters. So it's this realization that extreme events are now influenced by climate change. And Munich Re, which is this incredibly radical organization, it's the biggest reinsurance company in the world, and I would note, insurance companies care about risk. That's their job. They're not influenced by climate denial and ideology. They're influenced by what affects risk. They concluded, quote, the only plausible explanation for the rise in weather-related catastrophes is climate change, because they look at the data. And this is the number of weather-related catastrophes, and the different colors are hydrologic impacts and climatological impacts and meteorological impacts and geophysical impacts. These are natural phenomenon, are growing over time. And that's part of the concern in this piece of this industry. So let me talk about the drought in this context and maybe some specific local water issues. We're in a bad drought. This is this week's drought monitor. It's updated every week. I downloaded this morning. The new one will be out on Thursday, showing drought around the United States. And it varies at different times of the year. It varies over the years. But right now, the western U.S. is in a severe drought. And the truth is, California is in a really severe drought. 100% basically of California is in extraordinary drought. And it's the 4th year of a drought for us. I like this graph, so I'm going to spend a little time to explain it to you. This is an anomaly graph for temperatures and precipitation. Each of the little red dots is a year. Each year has an average temperature and an average precipitation. This is for California. So a dot that's right smack in the middle, and there isn't one exactly in the middle, would be a year with an exactly average temperature and exactly average precipitation, rainfall. And a dot that is to the to the right of the y-axis is a wet year. It's a precipitation anomaly. So if it's a little bit wetter, it's going to be plotted to the right of this axis. And any dot that's above the x-axis is a hotter than average year. And any dot that's below it is a cooler than average year. So you take every year's precipitation and temperature and you plot them. There's 2014. 2014 has not only been an extraordinarily dry, to the left of the axis, year, it's been an extraordinarily hot year. And in fact, the last 3 years in California have been the hottest 3 years on record. This isn't just a dry drought. This is a hot drought. And that's the climate change connection. In terms of precipitation, we've had 3 years of precipitation about the same level as the last 3 years over the last century or so. But we have never had a combination as hot and dry as we're having it now. And the temperature record is the influence of climate change. So I promised a little bit of conversation about solutions. There are solutions out there for our water challenges. There are lots of solutions out there for our water challenges. But we have to think differently about water than we thought about water in the 20th century. We have to rethink the concept of supply. The concept of supply used to be build another dam, tap another groundwater well into an overtapped aquifer, take more water from the next river basin. You know, why can't we just move water from the Missouri River or the Mississippi River or from Alaska? That used to be the concept of supply. And the old concept is running into peak water limits. We have to rethink the concept of supply. But we also have to rethink the concept of demand. What are we using water for? Is it possible to do the things that we want, grow food, make clothing, make semiconductors, have communications, with less water? If we can do what we want with less water, we're more efficient. We reduce the pressure on our water system. I'll talk a little bit about more of that in a second. We have to protect water quality. And we have to match the quality of the water we need with the quality of the water we have. So the first piece of this is probably self-evident. Protect water quality. We can clean up water. We have technology to clean up water to any standard, but it's far cheaper not to contaminate it in the first place. So protecting water quality. The other piece of this is a little less self-evident, and that is we don't need high-quality potable water for all of the things that we do. Why are we using this incredibly valuable high-quality water to flush our toilets or to water our lawns? Why do we have lawns at all? That's a separate issue. But if we were better at matching the qualities of the water that we have with the qualities of the water we needed, it turns out that offers enormous advantages for water systems. We have to be smarter about economics. We don't price water properly. Water is a human right, so declared by the UN in 2010. But water is also an economic good, and balancing the human right to water against water as an economic good is part of the debate right now in the water world. And part of that debate is properly pricing water. Most of us pay too little for water. We pay less for water than we pay for internet service or energy or cell phone service, or if you still have a landline, the two of you left in the audience that do, or cable TV, or a whole set of utilities. Water is our cheapest utility, but I would like to argue that maybe it's one of our more valuable ones, maybe our most valuable one. So smarter use of economics can help us manage water in a more effective way. We have to protect ecosystems. The idea that we can just take all the water we want and not care about ecosystems, there are still people who believe that, but it's wrong. It's always been wrong. We now know it's wrong, and we have to protect ecosystems. We have to do the things we want with water, but we have to integrate ecosystems into our planning. And part of the answer to that is we have to rethink our institutions and our management structures and the way we dealt with water in the 20th century so that it works better in the 21st century. And there are lots of pieces to that, but I like to say that we have 19th century water institutions and 20th century infrastructure, but 21st century problems. I've described this already, that the traditional solutions were already tapped out. This is a big version of the reservoir graph that I showed for California. We're not going to build more traditional reservoirs in California. We might build one or two more. There's always political pressure to build more reservoirs because some people think that's what we did in the 20th century, let's do it in the 21st century. And the graph might go up a tiny bit at the end, but at the end of the day, even if we build those reservoirs, our water problems will be the same as they are right now. That's not going to be the answer. But there are new sources of supply. When I said rethink supply, this is what I meant. We capture a tremendous amount of wastewater, and we treat it to a pretty high standard to meet federal and state laws. We could treat it to any standard we want, up to and including potable use. But we then typically throw that water away. And in California, we throw 5 million acre-feet of water, and urban water use in California is totally about 8 million acre-feet. We throw 5 million acre-feet of water away, wastewater, treated wastewater, into the ocean. That's a new source of supply. And there are new efforts statewide to figure out how to put treated wastewater to use for outdoor landscaping, for groundwater recharge, for industrial cooling, up to potentially potable reuse. So that's the groundwater replenishment picture on the left. That's in Orange County. It's a state-of-the-art plant that shows how we can do that. On the right is a desalination plant. People always ask me about desalination. 97% of the water on the planet is salt water. It's too salty to drink. It's too salty to use to grow crops. But we know how to take salt out of water. The technology's been around for a long time. It continues to improve. It's very expensive We will move eventually, and parts of the world are already moving in this direction, toward desalination. We're going to see more of it. I'm not opposed to that, but I think we probably ought to do the cheaper, smarter, more environmentally benign things first, and then think about desalination. And that's an option. Rainwater harvesting and cisterns. I mean, there are lots of new supply options out there that don't require taking more water out of the ecosystem or trying to overcome peak water limits that we can't overcome. But I would argue that the supply side of this isn't the preferred solution for places especially like California, but elsewhere. And the demand side is more important. Can we produce more food and goods and services with less water? And that's this issue of efficiency. So what's the first thing you do when you have a leaky bucket? Do you buy really much more expensive water and put it in the top, or do you plug the leaks? And what I'm arguing on the demand side is the first thing you do is you plug the leaks before you build expensive desalination to put into a leaky system. And by leaks, I mean inefficient toilets and shower heads and wasteful irrigation systems and literally leaks in our piping systems. Those are all inefficiencies. I don't mean brown lawns and shorter showers. So we do these things during droughts, during emergencies. We change our behavior. We're supposed to take shorter showers. We're supposed to let our lawns go brown. And those things save water in emergencies. But what I mean is permanent improvements in the efficiency of our water use so that we're not reducing our benefits, we're reducing our impact. Instead of a lawn, a drought-resistant garden. You can have a beautiful garden that uses a lot less water than a lawn. You can take the same shower you've always taken, but with an efficient shower head, or wash your clothes with an efficient washing machine, and the benefit you get's the same, but the water impact and the energy impact is different. Low-flow toilets. Our toilets used to use 6 gallons every time we flushed them in the 1980s. The best toilets now, which actually work better than those old toilets, use 1.2 or 1.3 gallons per flush. That's a 75%, 80% reduction in water use for the same benefit. And on and on. There are many examples. And I'll leave you with this. We're actually doing this. This is a graph that shows the gross national product of the United States from 1900 to 2010 and total water withdrawals in the United States over the same period of time. And it shows that exponential growth curve that economists love to see in the economy. That's the GNP of the United States. And for the first 3/4 of the 20th century, the darker blue line, the water withdrawals line, followed that curve. The assumption has always been population grows exponentially, the economy grows exponentially, our demand for resources grows exponentially. Water, energy, land, food, whatever. And that's what happened for the first part of the century. And then something happened in the late 70s, early 80s. We broke the link. We reached perhaps peak water in the United States. And today, we use less water in the United States for everything than we used in 1980. And on a per capita basis, we use a lot less. Part of this is efficiency. We're doing what we want with less water. Part of it is a little more complicated, and I won't go into it, but changes in the nature of our economy. We produce a lot more GNP out of the tech industry than we did out of steel per unit water. But we broke the curve, and there's a lot going on here, but this is good news in many ways in terms of our impact on the environment. So I'm going to stop there with some final thoughts. The water problem is real. It's bad. It's different in different parts of the world. There are consequences of failing to deal with water or energy or any of our sustainability issues. But not everything is getting worse. There are successes out there. We know a lot of what we need to do to change the curves that we're facing. And we need new solutions. We need new technologies that are scalable. We need better economics. We need smarter, more integrated institutions. And we need new commitments to thinking about and acting on these issues. And that requires partnerships, innovative partnerships, business and private sector and public sector partnerships. It means new tools of communications and social outreach. I think we can move in the right direction. I think we can move back from peak water, but it remains to be seen if we will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was awesome and inspiring, and I'm really glad that you talked about solutions at the end, because as with many talks about environmental limits, if we don't talk about those, you can end up feeling a little bit depressed and daunted. So we have time for a few questions. There are 2 mics in the middle of the room, so please come up to the mics and we'll take a few. I don't want to cut too much into the break or get us too far behind. We got a slightly late start, but I definitely want to give people a chance. So let's sort of alternate between the sides, if we will. So I think starting over here.
Peter, thanks so much. Gil Friend, City of Palo Alto.
Hi, Gil.
You talk about drought and you show the cyclical pattern of drought, but there's some research we're seeing suggesting that this is not a traditional cyclical drought, but a long-term shift in the precipitation regime and hydrological regime in California. Would you comment on that? Is that accurate or not, and what significance does that have for the strategies we're looking at?
Yeah, so California has droughts and floods. We have extremes like every part of the world in the natural hydrologic cycle. There's a really great debate going on right now in the climate science community about the influence of climate change on the current drought and on whether there is going to be a fundamental change in the cycle, whether we're due for longer-term, more persistent extreme events. I would say potentially floods and droughts. I don't know when the current drought's going to end. I don't know how deep it's going to be. I have a paper with a colleague that came out in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about a month ago, looking at the links between climate change and the current California drought. That's primarily that temperature link. Temperatures are going up. The Arctic is melting. Changes in the Arctic are leading to changes in atmospheric circulation patterns in the Pacific, which influences how much water and what kind of water systems hit the western U.S. I think there is a chance that we're going to see fundamental changes in extreme events on the west coast of the United States and, frankly, worldwide. But there's a lot we don't know about the details of that yet, and I think we're going to have to wait and see the answer to that, but that doesn't mean, I'm not implying that we need to wait and see about responding to those kinds of extreme events. We have to start planning for those now.
Hi, Dan Wilkowski, CRB Consulting Engineers in San Jose. 80% of the water use in California is for agriculture, yet the state has mandated that cities and water districts cut back severely, and we have brown lawns and don't flush our toilets as often as we used to. Do we have to wait for demand side for consumers to stop buying almonds and rice from California in order to change the agricultural use of water?
Okay, so these are like 2-hour-long questions or answers. That's a huge question. It's a big debate right now about the balance between agricultural water use, which uses 80% of the water humans use in California, and the cities, which use 20%. And yet the agricultural economy is a much, much smaller fraction of our economy. It's 5 or 10% at most, depending on how you count it, of the state's economy. Agriculture's suffered severe cutbacks as well. The urban use requirement of the call for 25% reduction in urban water use. Agriculture's seen cutbacks to 0 for some surface deliveries. Senior water rights, which have never been cut back, are now being cut back. The agricultural community is feeling the pain as well. But there has to be a fundamental reform, I think, in California's water system. It's a complicated system. It has to do with water rights. It has to do with economics. It has to do with ecosystem preservation and Endangered Species Act and dying salmon runs. It's a huge topic. I guess all I can say is that I hope that the severe drought is opening the door to some of the conversations we ought to be having about reforming California water policy. And there's steps moving in the right direction now. But I think we're going to have to see.
Hey, great presentation, Peter. Kenneth with Sunrun. I'm a consultant there. I had a question. How many years could a state survive with the continued hot and dry drought period that you mentioned on the chart that you showed us?
So the state can survive forever. The question is, what are the impacts going to be? And I think that's really what you're asking. What are the consequences if these kinds of trends continue? And Gil's question got to that as well. And if it continues, we're going to see fundamental reforms in agriculture. We're going to see changes in what we grow and how farmers grow it. And we're already seeing those changes. Farmers are already more efficient than they were 20 years ago. You know, people complain about almonds. Almonds are a high-valued crop. Farmers are pretty smart. They grow things that return money to them. And we grow a lot less cotton than we used to, which is a good thing, that we're growing less cotton. So we'll see fundamental changes in agriculture. Frankly, we ought to see no more lawns. The idea of an eastern lawn in a western climate is an idea that's time has passed. And a lot of the parts of the Southwest, Tucson in particular, have made a lot more progress in getting rid of grass lawns and replacing them with more water efficient, very nice gardens. That's something we're going to see in California. We'll see all sorts of changes along the lines of demand management and the changes in the kinds of things we use water for.
Hi, Peter. Great presentation. You know, just the sense of ownership of water. Do you think there'll be a day where we don't feel like we're owners, but we're more members? Is there a water pass coming? Is there limits? And in energy, the interface to energy, the visualization of energy, it's really changed our sense of being able to do something until, you know, getting our bill 45 days later and it's too late. Do you see the connectivity, the cloud, the kind of things that happen here on this campus, the stuff that Bill works on in energy? Do you see that same visualization and change of ownership to membership of water?
That's a great question, and I don't really know the best way to answer it, except that people really care about water. People care much more about water in a visceral way than they do about energy or fossil fuels or other resources. Partly because energy is so fundamental to everything. It's sort of the most important resource. And it's part of the debate behind the human right to water versus water as an economic good, behind commercialization and privatization of water, which really provokes a lot of people, behind the idea of bottled water versus tap water. I think the good news is people care about water, and they're beginning to take it on as not just an economic issue, but as a social and a cultural issue as well. In many ways, that's one of the things that gives me a lot of hope about dealing with water issues. It's because when there's not enough water, people are willing to rethink what it means in their lives.
My name's Katherine Kirby. I'm in recruiting here at Facebook. And my question was actually very similar to that one. And when you're thinking about how water works across with energy across the board and the economic scale of that, at what point do you think consumers are going to start noticing it in their bill to curb and change their water behavior and usage? And where does that kind of level out? You know, housing prices in San Francisco go up and people keep paying them and moving in. And at what point do people and these young software engineers who make oodles of money just come in and pay it and not think about it? And where do they actually start noticing it?
Yeah, another great question. And in the end, when I was talking about solutions, I talked about technology, I talked about economics, I talked about regulatory systems and institutions. Pricing is a very important tool for helping people make decisions about everyday life. We price things and give people the choice about whether or not to buy them. Water is underpriced. Water utilities are using pricing of water as a tool to help encourage efficient use. And we have increasing block rates where the first bit of water you use is relatively cheap because it's for basic needs. If you're using a lot of water, you pay a lot more per unit water because the truth is you're using that vast amount of water on your outdoor landscaping. And that helps people make decisions differently. But it's also true that for many users, it doesn't really matter. The price is not a good enough signal. And in that sense, we have to move to other tools. We have to move to regulatory restrictions. We have to ask people to limit the amount of lawn, not by price, but by some sort of regulatory constraint. We have to put in place appliance efficiency standards so that all appliances are efficient, independent of the price. So I'm a believer in in technology and economics and regulatory systems as a whole as an answer to some of these problems.
Let's take this one last question. Let's try to make it quick, and then we're going to take a break.
You bet. This is actually a couple of comments. First of all, to the last, my name is Steve Attinger with the City of Mountain View. To the last question or comment about water usage and where is that going to affect consumers, you're talking about the issues related to pricing and whether that's going to work. So the City of Mountain View, for example, is going to see water rate increases of up to 28% in the next 3 years. Residents and businesses are already being asked to reduce their water usage significantly, about 25% in the next year. So that's one thing. So we're already beginning to see market mechanisms adapting to the economics of what's going on. The second comment I wanted to make is I really appreciate you drawing the connection between water usage and food. And it's one of those things that people kind of don't really yet have a grasp for. I also want to encourage everyone to take a look at the New York Times article from about 3 to 4 weeks ago. They had a full front page spread that made the connection between the amount of water used to produce crops. Almonds was at the top of the list, 1,000 gallons of water are needed to produce a pound of almonds. So I think a solution that we can all take on right now, as opposed to the bigger issues, is really what can we do in our daily lives. And one of the things I've started to do is I'm a huge almond fan, and I'm just not eating almonds anymore. Just an idea. Take a look at the New York Times article.
And I hope that, I actually haven't checked the menu for lunch. I hope we don't have almond-crusted beef, because that would be really bad. God help me if we do. All right, so let's thank Peter. That was really awesome. Really appreciate it.